therapists and friends and family and court and mediators will often blame the person in that narcissistic relationship and say, well, how didn't you see it? Why didn't you get it? Why didn't you get out of it? Why not ask the question of how dare that narcissistic person behave that way? Today, this one's in response to a question that was sent in to me. And this person had said, people are so judgmental if you're estranged from your family. In this person's case, they had a narcissistic family. How do you navigate this judgment? This is such a relevant question for this channel because this question comes up a lot from folks who are from narcissistic family systems. It's one of the most complicated spaces because the harm done by narcissistic families is quite deep. It affects your sense of self, your identity, how you go through the world, how you talk to yourself. So that's enough harm. Sadly, these patterns almost never resolve in families. So your ongoing contact with a family is rarely going to be healthy. Now, many people don't feel they can go fully no contact. And there may be a wide array of reasons for this, from the practical, cultural, duty, obligation, or perhaps there are some family members you do like and having to endure your narcissistic parent as part of being able to still interact with them. Your reasons are your reasons. But you also know that the ongoing contact with a narcissistic family system takes a toll. It's just the nature of the beast. But some of you, however, did decide to go no contact or really cut off most contact. And that is no small decision. It's actually quite galling when people look at people who are estranged from their families and accuse them of taking the easy way out. I actually think that the decision to cut away from a family system is one of the more difficult things a person can do. Some people do it somewhat abruptly, knowing that if they were to try to explain themselves to their family, that they would end up even more abused, gaslighted, and it would only set them back, or that they would be vulnerable to the manipulations that the family was engaging in that would pull them back in. Some people sort of do their no contact in pieces. They try their best to connect to the narcissistic parent or the narcissistic family system. Then they start gradually going lower and lower and lower contact, and then they're all out. It's painful because you may be trying to only excise or cut out one family member, like just one parent or a sibling. But it does tend to end up being an all or nothing deal, since these are deeply enabled family systems in which even the folks you like a little may be chronically putting the push on you to reconcile. So some of you are going to go no contact. And this will carry with it the label of you being estranged from your family. There's a lot of bias against this, and I'm always struck by the bias people carry against familial estrangement. It happens. You had no choice or say in these people that were assigned to you as family. It was the roll of the dice. And as anyone who plays dice will tell you, they actually roll wrong more often than they roll right. So if your luck didn't hold out and you are in a system that was rigid, harmful, manipulative, resistant to change, distancing yourself to protect yourself, to save yourself, is a difficult, but for many people a necessary choice. The bigger issue really comes up when you have to sort of take this out into the world. How do you navigate sharing this, that you're estranged from your family? How do you go about doing that with the world? It amazes me how undeveloped so many people's frontal lobes are well into adulthood, and that they feel that they have the right to ask intrusive questions, get an answer, and then be judgmental or even more intrusive about your answer. So here are some thoughts about how you navigate this issue of family estrangement if you're out in the world. First of all, you got to remember, you owe nobody the details of your life. If you have grown up in a narcissistic family, problematic boundaries came with the territory. and experiencing intrusiveness from them, and then experiencing their withdrawal if you ask for something that they didn't want to be bothered with, that comes with the territory. You lose your personal sovereignty when you grow up in a narcissistic family system. So safeguarding yourself is so important in the aftermath of experiencing this. And part of that means that you may be quite protective when it comes to sharing about yourself. And all of this falls under that idea of discernment. The details of your family or familial estrangement may still be quite painful, and even something that you still have difficulty processing. So if you decide that you do not want to share it, then that is your right and your privilege. Somebody says to you, tell me about your family. Do you talk to them very often? You can just give a vague, I don't know, we haven't been that in touch. I'm sure that they're fine. You can give them that kind of vague answer and then change the subject. If that other person pushes you, you can then say, yeah, I don't have much to say about it. If they push even more, step away or say, I don't think you're hearing me. I'd prefer not to talk about it. And by the way, at that point, it's a them thing, definitely not a you thing. And secondly, if you do decide to talk about it or feel you can, again, you decide how much to share. You may decide to take the path of being bold. You might say, my mother's a raging narcissist. She did enough damage and I am not allowing her to do more. And then you sit back and wait for their response. If you're lucky, the other person will get it and let you know that they are sorry, or maybe even share a similar story. If you're not as lucky, the other person may judge or criticize or be rude. Again, this is why discernment becomes so important. You feel something coming out, or if they're coming at you, if you feel someone coming at you with an interrogation, that may not be the person to share any of this with. If the person is asking vague questions and not demanding answers, or you're dealing with someone who's been empathic when you've dealt with them in the past, or even during your interaction with them, maybe you decide to tread in slowly on the topic. And third, you may also decide to take the middle ground and say, we're no longer in contact. It has been complicated and painful, but this is my choice. I'm okay, and I'd prefer to not talk about it. A healthy person will receive that and say, got it, thanks for sharing, and I'm sorry you went through that. An intrusive, judgy person may say any number of things like, oh, come on, how bad could a family will be? Or my favorite is that they will tell you, you better be careful. You may regret that someday. Be careful. Ask yourself how you will feel when they die, as though you did not do this multiple times. Your estrangement, your history with your family is your business, nobody else's. And frankly, this experience and how other people receive it becomes a great litmus test. If someone hears about your experience of estrangement and is unable to hear it with respect, empathy, and compassion, they really are not someone who you keep close. A sort of keep them on the list of the need-to-know basis kind of person. And you also do not need to be the estrangement teacher. The judgmentalness, the intrusiveness, and the I have the answers arrogance of someone who critiques your difficult life and decision, that, again, is a reflection on them and their poor boundaries, and maybe even their toxicity. The hard work for any of us is to not internalize that. These judgmental encounters can feel like a recapitulation of all of the toxic stuff that happened within your narcissistic family. And you often need a second to get your legs back under you again when you're dealing with someone who's critiquing this. The obsession with family at any cost has done irreparable harm to many survivors of familial narcissistic abuse. Listen, in the casino of life, some folks just sit at a cold table and end up in a family that does not do right by them. Throwing good money after bad never works. Narcissistic family systems are about projected shame, about a parent projecting their self-shame and judgments on their own children so they can walk around feeling great about themselves, and their children carry that burden. That's enough shame for one lifetime. Navigating these situations means discernment, assessing your level of comfort, and also sniffing out whether these are people who can be respectful with your experience. If they can't, then stick with a party line. And if someone asks you straight out, "Why aren't you in touch with your family?" you can respond, "They just weren't good for me." Because they weren't. I hope that's helpful. And I think I said good money after bad, or is it bad money after good? I'm not sure which it is, but either way, it's not worth it. I'm going to take on this issue if it's happened to you. This person says, "I'm embarrassed that I still love the narcissistic person in my life." It's a tough one, this feeling, and it's a very real one. So I put the question to you. Do you still love any of the narcissistic people who are in your life, or were or are in your life? Many of us do. Could be a parent, certainly, but it could be a current partner, it could even be an ex-partner. And if you really admit it to yourself, hard as it may be, after all you might have been through in this relationship, you still love them. And that can be a really complicated feeling. People feel so embarrassed that they still love someone who has been so harmful to them, that lots of people won't admit that this is the way they feel. They won't admit it even to themselves. They may believe it's ridiculous and that they should have their picture on the cover of the Masochist Times, so that they don't want to admit that it's happening. As a therapist, I can say that a lot of folks out there need a minute to even say that they think they might still love the narcissistic person in the protected and non-judgmental space of therapy. So that really raises the question, why do we still love them? Are we still trauma bonded? Is that what it is? Is it even really love if they are narcissistic? Yeah, it's still love. You had a real experience with them. You were probably doing most of the heavy lifting in the relationship and bringing your A game. But there were, and maybe even still are, things you love. It could be anything from how you saw them, from sense of humor, to their sex, to how they played with children, your children together, to their intellect. These things were real, and you're going to impede your healing if you merely file all of this under trauma bond. Just because the narcissistic person is inauthentic and insincere doesn't mean that you have to be inauthentic and insincere to heal. You experience something real. Now, to feel strong, many folks coming out of narcissistic relationships will say, "Ew, God, no, I don't love them. That's gross, awful. I didn't feel anything at the end of that relationship." Be careful. Narcissistic folks aren't the only people with egos. Yes, their egos are distorted and fragile, but the fact is all people have egos. And our egos may leave us feeling and wanting to protect ourselves and say, "I don't want to admit to loving them," as though it might make you weak. It doesn't make you weak at all. And what is so sad is that if the narcissistic people could have let in the love that you gave them, it would have been a game changer. But that wasn't your job, to force feed that to them. You tried hard enough. Loving relationships mean receiving the love as much as giving it. And their inner house of mirrors means that everything bounces back on itself instead of them being able to see that they're being seen. It gets confusing. But they can't. And let's face it, you exhausted yourself for years trying to be what they wanted and to appease them and to leave them feeling loved. For them, love is a lot more about control, about being able to control the other for what feels good for them. For you, love may very well have been about a shared experience. There's really no path forward in these relationships. But as people come out of any kind of narcissistic relationship, whether it is ending a long-term intimate relationship, ending a relatively new relationship, or disengaging from a close family member, grief is often the primary emotion. There is such a sense of loss, of time lost, emotion lost, opportunity lost, yourself lost, that as it ends, you feel lost from all the loss. Lost in the grief that you loved them, and painfully so. You may still love them. You can't talk yourself out of that. But also keep in mind, loving someone doesn't mean you need to be in a relationship with them. When I work with clients on this, we break it down. I ask them bluntly, what did you love about them? Many times we come to the realization that what they loved was sometimes around a hope. I loved that we were building a life together. I loved belonging to something. I loved that we shared a child. But the things that they loved weren't about the narcissistic person, but rather about the experience that got to be shared with this person. That doesn't make it any easier to grieve, but it is a reminder of how complex the emotion of love is. It's complex when it's a parent. Our love for a parent is primal. It's often survival and attachment and safety based. But people do stop loving their parents. And parental love often represents this messy place of duty, obligation, respect, nostalgia, some good memories, maybe some circumspection about what their lives were like before you were ever born, and being aware of those complexities. But no matter the relationship, parent, partner, friend, whomever, some folks will say, I love them, and sometimes mistakenly believe that if you love them, that you should go back into it. Or you might view yourself as codependent for loving them. It's not true. We love for such complex reasons. We love on the basis of interests, attraction, shared values, history, narratives that we write about a person and ourselves with that person, hopes, dreams. We love because someone feels familiar. We love because someone feels brand new. Narcissistic people are compelling, and when it's good, and that can feel like love. Just because what was reciprocated back to you didn't have the depth of what you gave doesn't mean that what you felt wasn't love. And none of us are switches. We can't just turn emotions on and off. Over time, that love, that embarrassing love you feel may morph into something very complex, a melancholy, a grief, a discomfort, a curiosity, or even just a memory. But never shame your feelings. The most courageous thing you can do is admit you did love them, and frankly, you might still love them. Honesty is an essential first step to all healing. And it also allows you to unpack and really delve into the meaning of what does it mean to love someone. It doesn't mean you have to run back into it. And then it also takes us to that idea of multiple truths that I've talked about, that we can love someone and also acknowledge that the structure and the behaviors in the relationship aren't working. It's one of the most difficult things to admit, that we love someone and it doesn't work. The acceptance of a narcissistic relationship is often accompanied by tremendous grief. Grief is very much a universal part of the experience of people in these relationships and of people leaving these relationships. It's the acceptance that this is not going to change. The acceptance that it will never get better. The acceptance that you do not get to go backwards and get a do-over of childhood with more responsive or more available parents. It's the acceptance, perhaps, that your children will not get the vision you had of them, of two parents living under one roof model of a happy childhood. It's the acceptance that this is not how you thought your love story would go. This acceptance happens regardless of whether you leave the relationship or stay. And not everyone gets to acceptance, but if you don't, you're constantly living in a world of disappointment. And obviously, if you leave the relationship, or your partner leaves the relationship, or your family decides to step away, then there is the grief of the actual loss of a relationship. So it's losses all around, whether it's the loss of an idea or the loss of the actual relationship. We often reserve the term grief for the loss associated with death. But that's only just one piece of the pie of grief. Grief ultimately is about loss, meaningful, profound loss. The challenge is that while we in the mental health space may understand that others may not, and when you say you're experiencing grief, the first thing you may get back is, why? What grief? Nobody's dead. The experience of judgment that people in narcissistic relationships have to face is actually really unsettling for them as they go through their process of healing. It's either gaslighting. You'll hear things like, all relationships are tough. No family is perfect. It can't be that bad. Or it's the sense of shame that survivors feel for staying. They don't feel, for example, people stay in these relationships because they don't feel ready to leave. They feel too confused and they hold back on sharing with other people about the mess that their relationship is for fear of being judged when they stay in their relationship, and of their partner, or maybe it's the case it's a family member who's the narcissistic person. They know that if they talk too much about it, other people will view that person poorly, and that's going to be a problem if they decide to stay in that relationship. Or there's the isolation that comes from hearing about other people's healthier marriages or relationships or families. And either you might lie or soft pedal what your situation is so you can stay in the conversation to avoid a sense of shame, or just not talk at all, which is very isolating. Or you might have the experience of going into therapy and being told about your anxiety and being told, oh, you're very anxious, and maybe once you work on your anxiety, things will be easier in your relationship because your anxiety is probably really problematic for your partner. So it's pretty much judgment all the time for people who are going through grief. And then you may really start hitting it with the grief. It's as though the term has been annexed in a way that only certain people get to use it, right? You have a dead parent, then you get to talk about grief. If you have a narcissistic parent that you have to go no contact with, then people are going to tell you you're being difficult. If you have a dead spouse, you get to call it grief. If you have to face the unending anguish of having to either manage a toxic marriage or a toxic divorce and the contentious issues around joint custody, you'll hear back from people, oh, divorce is hard. You have a dead sibling, that gets to be called grief. If you have a sibling who continues to triangulate and divide the family and is making a mess of family accounts, businesses, trusts, or mistreating other family members, you'll get back, oh, families are tough, but you got to stick together. And what happens then is that the person enduring this narcissistic relationship feels as though they are not entitled to the language and the process of grief. And they get pushed into the language of a person who just has difficult and tense relationships and is just sort of struggling to figure all that out, instead of the far more robust vocabulary of grief. Most people have difficulty understanding that grief can be about the loss of what we hoped for: a loving parent, a happy family, a healthy marriage. And so it may not even be about a person, but a narrative, a simple want. I don't think, actually, it's aspirational to hope for loving parents. I think that's a basic human want, a very basic human deserving need. And that when a person gets into adulthood and recognizes that they didn't have the important psychological stuff of childhood that shapes a confident adult, it hurts. And a lot of time can get wasted ruminating about how could it have been different. Many people in adulthood look back at the child they were, looking to a parent or parents for consistency, validation, safety, compassion, support, and unconditional love. And it hurts to imagine what their child selves went through. People who endure this recognize that you cannot go backwards and unring that bell. But you can grieve it not happening in the first place. I've talked over and over about the loss of innocence that these relationships represent. Many people who are going through narcissistic relationships often feel that they have become cynical, for lack of a better word. They wanted to be open-eyed and open-hearted and optimistic and warm and fuzzy and feel that because of this narcissistic relational experience, that open-heartedness has been taken. More grief over losing that. It'll take a minute, but someday you'll see that cynicism as discernment. Many people going through narcissistic grief have told me that others have said it isn't grief, that they are using the wrong word. And the gaslighting continues, basically, just keeps going on and on and on, that relationships end and people have problems, and that doesn't make it grief. So a lot of people will just sort of challenge your use of this word. Yes, it does. Something important and heartfelt was lost. Even if it was your belief system, that's extraordinarily important. Something important being lost. When grief is judged, it impedes the process of grief. A person whose grief is judged may censor their experience or not allow it to flow out of them or identify it as grief and or something related to grief. And when we are not given the space to have our grief, if we try to rush through it, if we try to avoid it, if we try to skip it, it comes back at us. And that can result in longer-term mental health issues, physical illness, stress, and distraction. Grief is simply one of those things that you cannot outrun. Grief also looks different after a person has experienced narcissistic abuse. And this goes beyond the scope of this video. But some stages of the grief process, such as anger, actually do look different than what we would consider to be traditional grief. In grief, for example, after a death, a person may be angry that a person who's died is gone or that they went too soon. It's sort of almost an anger at the world at losing this person. In grief from narcissistic abuse, the anger is far more wide and complex. Anger that someone could behave like this. Anger that it happened to you. Anger that you didn't get out of the relationship sooner. Anger at getting bad advice about the relationship and sticking around because you kept fostering the hope. Anger at not understanding the dynamics of a narcissistic relationship. The complexity of the grief stages means that it takes a while, and that's the nature of grief. It takes as long as it takes. I often liken grief to the phases of the moon. You can't rush it. You can't slow it down. The full moon is always going to come sometime within 28 days. It's a process, and you can't wish it to come faster. Now, unlike the moon, grief doesn't follow a schedule. But just like that moon, you can't wish it away, and it takes as long as it takes. Judging narcissistic grief is like judging any emotion for a person. To judge someone's emotion is disrespectful, abusive, and it is a form of gaslighting. If someone tells you that you are not grieving, sadly, it means one more relationship you have to give a hard look at and assess at whether this relationship is healthy for you. And then in the midst of grief, the idea of more changes, more losses, more disappointments can feel overwhelming. Your experience of loss of relationship, loss of hope, loss of innocence is real. I hope this channel and other communities out there are showing you this, that these losses are real, no matter what it is you lost, and that because these losses are real and profound, grief is a meaningful way to characterize this. You do not ever need to prove your feelings or experience to anyone. And that pressure survivors of narcissistic relationships have, that they have to show up with proof of what happened, proof of their suffering, proof, look, this is what this person did. One of the most important things we can say to survivors of these kinds of traumatic relationships is, I believe you. And then go from there. I have a very, I don't know what to call it, like a guilty hobby maybe, of reading like tabloidy pop culture magazines. I do it for a couple of reasons, partly because it's a guilty pleasure, but I never know anyone I'm reading about. But my main reason for doing it is I'm trying to get a vibe on what sort of the public conversation is about relationships and love and dating, especially in an era of online dating and stuff like that. As an older person, I'm not always up on it. So I was then reading an article about someone, I actually didn't know who they were. My team explained who it was. I'm not even going to mention this person's name because this video isn't about, because again, I'm about civility. This video isn't about like bringing an individual down, you know, I mean, it's more of a, that's not what I'm interested in. What troubled me was I came to find out that the person who made this statement has a very big platform. And because of that, when somebody says something like this, and I know the impact it's going to have on survivors, I get very concerned. So let me read you what this person wrote, okay? Or I should say person said. I read it and I was like, what the? And then I read it again. I was like, what the actual? And then the third time I read it, I sent it to my team and I said, I think I'm offended by this. Okay, so this is what this person said. Quote, if you're with somebody, and let me go back, but this person is talking about a romantic relationship or a marriage. Okay, so quote, if you're with somebody that doesn't make you feel heard or safe or put you on a pedestal or just honored in a way, it's not worth it. If you can't be authentically yourself while you're madly in love with somebody, you're not in the right relationship. So you're all like, whoa, Dr. Ramani, what's wrong with that? Nothing. Here's the punchline. She then went on to say, so if you can't be, all the stuff she said, you can't authentically be yourself while you're madly in love and you're not in the right relationship. If you stay in this relationship, she's saying, it's not serving you at all or the other person, and it's selfish. And I was like, what? It's selfish? So basically, every single person out there who is in a narcissistically abusive relationship where they're being invalidated and manipulated and devalued and minimized and gaslighted and baited and yelled at, they sure as hell aren't being put on any kind of damn pedestal. They definitely don't feel safe. They're not being honored, and they can't be authentically themselves. If a person stays in that kind of relationship, according to this person, you are selfish. I was so offended. I went back and I read it 3 times. I screenshotted it, sent it to other people. Am I wrong? And you're thinking, well, no, you're not. You better be thinking, no, you're not, folks, because this is the problem. That by dint of a person staying in a relationship where they're being treated badly, the person who stays in the relationship is selfish, because that's not nice to the other person who's not putting you on a pedestal. That's basically, and Dr. Ramani speaks, saying you're being selfish because you're staying in a relationship with somebody who's emotionally abusing you. I have a problem with that. Because that languaging is in essence, what you're doing is you're harming your abuser because you're staying in the relationship with them. Now, this person obviously is no relationship guru, and after reading this person's relationship history and all that, don't know that they should be. But the fact that bothered me, above all else, this person's life is irrelevant to us, is that they have a platform. And on that big platform, not as a mental health expert, not as a person who is training in relationships, but just as a person, but that everyone will listen to. There's folks out there listening who might be a fan of this person who will think, well, I'm not on a pedestal and I'm not being myself authentically and I'm staying with this person because I'm scared to get out of this. But now this person I value is telling me that I'm selfish. This right here is why so many survivors struggle. Sure, you may come to this channel, of channels like this, content out there, and say, okay, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm right, this relationship isn't right, this isn't healthy. You're getting some validation. But there's a bigger landscape out there of people who this person, I read the rest of the article, turns out this person's very happy in their particular marriage and things have worked out for them. Good for you. Okay, great for you. You find yourself a happy relationship. I'm actually very happy for people. But this is like going to somebody who's saying, my expertise in having a relationship is merely that I'm happy, is like me consulting with a lottery winner on how to pick 6 numbers. It doesn't make sense. You got lucky, right? At some level, she got lucky. This ain't about work. It's in many ways about luck. And then people like to say, yeah, because we work so hard. No, it's because somebody isn't invalidating and gaslighting you on the daily. Good for you. But when people have these platforms and they shame folks who are stuck in situations that they don't know how they can get out of, that trauma bonding is making it even harder psychologically to pull themselves out and to be labeled and branded as selfish, that is not okay. For you, as a survivor of the narcissistically abusive relationships and the fallout that follows, you not only have to be discerning regarding the kinds of people you maintain relationships with, the way you set boundaries, the way you go through the world, you also have to be discerning about what you read. Because for a moment I tried to think, okay, you're not Dr. Ramani who studies narcissism, you're a person who's been through this. Try to be in that space and you're reading something like this. And I'll tell you this, I kind of felt sick. I felt sick like, well, there's something wrong with me because, wait a minute, when I stayed in that relationship for a really long time when I was being mistreated, I was being selfish because I was staying in a relationship that was unhealthy. What? And then I really took it to a place where there are people out there who don't have the supports I have and had, who may not have access to the resources I have, and they're reading something like that, and it's really eating themselves up. So now not only are they in a relationship where they're not being put on a pedestal, where they don't know how to get out, not only are they stuck in something terrible, now they get to sit with that, plus the self-blame they face as survivors. And why don't we throw on top of that some random, for some reason, celebrity, for reason I'm not clear on why this person is, but some celebrity person is saying you're selfish. This is why, unfortunately, in the era of social media and internet, when anyone can say some kind of foolish thing and it can travel around the world like that, and platforms are given to people who say these things, that survivors now face the double duty of reading things that are put out there, people that they might even be fans of, and having to learn to read this stuff with a more discerning eye or a more critical eye, or better yet, don't read it at all. That's an example of a celebrity making an insensitive comment, but it also helps us reflect on the idea of how many people have to listen to this kind of nonsense from the people in their day-to-day lives, the real enablers, or the people who just don't want to see it, the people who say, well, if your marriage isn't happy, well, maybe you're being selfish staying in this, or you're being selfish not appreciating this, or how come you're not on a pedestal? And you know I've said on this channel, someone putting you on a pedestal is already a dangerous precedent anyhow. But forget the celebrity talking nonsense. In your own life, you might get feedback that is shaming and invalidating. And it makes the process of making decisions about these relationships, setting boundaries, to stop blaming yourself, to sort of stop listening to that invalidating narrative. It makes it all the more difficult because just when you get your head over the wall, you see the light and you say, I am not going to feel shame about being in a toxic relationship. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even understand this. And yet somebody can so, in such a dismissive way, say, well, you must be selfish for staying in a relationship where everything isn't just picture perfect. It's insensitive. It doesn't account for the real experience of toxic relationships that so many people are enduring. So I guess the best takeaway we can get is definitely don't take your relationship advice from somebody who has no place giving it, Sure, you can share your story, and if the person had stopped there and kept, wanted to go on and on and on about how wonderful their marriage is, how wonderful their children are, how wonderful their life is, great, good for them. Heaven bless you. Go forth and consider yourself a fortunate one. But then to twist their good fortune, to frame it as though somebody's selfish for staying in something that isn't good, I got a real problem for that. I got a real problem with that, I should say. And this is probably why you shouldn't be turning, none of us should ever turn to a celebrity for relationship advice. A wise man doesn't fall down the same hill twice. I love this proverb, but I also don't love this proverb, so let's sort of take it both ways. This proverb, a wise man doesn't fall down the same hill twice, is an African proverb. When I read it initially, I paused because it reminded me precisely just how complicated healing from narcissistic abuse really is, and more importantly, many of the fears that people encounter as they heal. As I see it, and I'm kind of oversimplifying it a little bit, but there are two pathways there are two pathways a person can take after a person gets harmed by a narcissist and gets out of the relationship. Okay, so they get out of the relationship. Pathway one is a person gets out of the relationship. They don't quite understand what happened to them in the relationship. They knew it was a mess and they knew it was a bad relationship, but they never quite learn what narcissism is. They're angry when they get out of the relationship and they can't believe someone did to them what happened in that relationship, or the person leaves the relationship and they're just hurt, and maybe they even wonder what's wrong with they themselves. But they still don't understand narcissism. And as a result, the cycle is very likely to happen again after the person gets out of that one narcissistic relationship, likely to happen again with other people they meet or other people in their lives. Then there's pathway two. In pathway two, a person gets out of the relationship and they learn everything they can about narcissistic abuse. They want to heal, but they are scared of other people, and especially scared of entering into another narcissistic relationship. These are people who are concerned that they will always be closed off and that they see narcissism everywhere in every person they encounter. These people in pathway two, want to be the wise people who don't fall down the same hill twice, but as you can see in pathway two, there's sometimes a risk of an overcorrection. The fact is that once you have been harmed, hurt, manipulated, and played by a narcissistic person, you feel you can never trust again, and the world can look like a very dangerous place. It is critical that you know about it. We know that the narcissistic and antagonistic folks out there have, I don't know, some kind of radar or something. They really seem to be able to find the people who will be most receptive to them. It's as though narcissistic people have a unique ability to smell out empathy and compassion and the people who are willing to give them second chances. And then, like a spider, they're able to build a web and bam, they catch these very kind people often in our midst. So it's a really difficult balancing act of how can you retain compassion and empathy and at the same time not be a narcissist magnet. So basically, it goes to the proverb, how can you avoid falling down the damned hill again? So if you don't know at the time you're in or leaving a narcissistic relationship, if you don't know what it is and just blame yourself and don't see the narcissism of it all, I can all but guarantee it's going to happen again, especially because of trauma bonding and almost the silent pull of these dangerous people. Some people, when they come out of narcissistic relationships, I must say in some cases I've seen it, it's quite sad, they just shut down forever. They never enter into another relationship, and they feel that it is the safest way to stay out of harm's way is just to not get close to anyone ever again. This is avoidance behavior, and it's a very common trauma response. I truly believe that people in this situation, over time, may build the fortress around them, but perhaps with therapy and with some good supports around them, they may slowly over time remove a few bricks from the fortress wall and maybe let people in a little further. This is a very personal process, and it has to move at a pace that allows a person to feel safe, but hopefully happens so a person then is also not always cut off from the world and the supports that they may be able to cultivate in the world. It's a balancing act. There is this shame experience that people have after they go through a narcissistic relationship. People who go through narcissistic relationships, they feel foolish. They feel that anyone else would have seen this narcissist coming from 100 miles. Many people who've been through narcissistic relationships don't want to be even more judged by the world, so they will often isolate. In fact, a pattern that we often see in trauma bonding is the tendency to not tell other people about how bad the relationship is. That means then the relationship can sustain and persist because there is no outside awareness or accountability. And this also, though, avoids the shame for the other person in the narcissistic relationship. This shame can mean that people are so confused when they move forward and are afraid of making the same mistake again. Of people saying, oh, there they go again, there you are, gosh, you really do have a bad picker, you're good at picking those narcissists, which is in essence victim blaming, blaming the person who got into this relationship, rather than really addressing the issue with the narcissist who was the one abusing them. I gotta tell you, I really am getting sick and tired and actually quite angry at people for blaming people for choosing badly. That's like blaming people for being burglarized because they didn't lock their door one time. Okay, you didn't lock your damn door, but that wasn't permission for someone to come into your house and take your stuff. Be angry at the burglar, not the poor person who didn't remember to lock their door. It's exactly the same with narcissism. Okay, you didn't see the red flags, but that wasn't effing permission for someone to come in and gaslight and invalidate and manipulate. And yet, therapists and friends and family and court and mediators will often blame the person in that narcissistic relationship and say, well, how didn't you see it? Why didn't you get it? Why didn't you get out of it? Why not ask the question of how dare that narcissistic person behave that way? So let's go back to the proverb. And sorry for getting a bit worked up there, I'm having a day, but I agree and I disagree with the proverb. I don't think this is about wisdom, the idea of the wise man, right? I don't think this is about wisdom. I have met many very wise narcissistic abuse survivors who do get played again and again, including myself. They say, if the choice is to cut myself off from all people versus actually being in the world, well, I actually do want people in my life, so I guess they take the risk. So they fall down a few more hills. Maybe they fall down the hill again, not because they weren't wise, but because they were brave. It takes some real badass courage to put your heart out there again after you have been through narcissistic abuse, and to take the leap of faith to trust another person again. And yep, if you do that, you may very well fall down the hill again. I don't know, maybe the next time the hill will be shorter, or maybe there will be more people at the bottom of that hill to help you when you fall. But if you fall down the hill again, it's not that you are not wise, it's not that you are foolish, but perhaps because you are brave. We really need to break out of the habit of blaming and punishing people for experiencing abuse. It simply emboldens the abusers to just find their next victim and leaves the survivors feeling isolated, shamed, and silenced. Just like a proverb I talked about recently on a video about the idea of getting lost is to learn the way, I see this proverb as a bit of a riff on that. But I know personally, as a survivor of narcissistic abuse, I just keep falling down the hill. I notice that as I get older, the hills are getting a little bit shorter. I'm lucky I have some more people in my life to help me dust off. But the formula for me is that I don't want to lose my empathy. I don't want to cut off from all people. I'll acknowledge I am far, far, far less trusting than before, and I allow very, very few people to get very close to me anymore. But I still I do still meet people, and I still do make mistakes. And I still make mistakes with the people who are narcissistic, who are still in my life. Maybe we could consider rewording this proverb and say something that, like, a wise person falls down shorter and shorter hills. Please remember that there is life after narcissistic abuse. And the wisdom of life is that hopefully we see the narcissist a little bit sooner. But after going through it, we don't lose our empathy and compassion, but rather we dole it out more wisely. We don't enable, we give ourselves permission to set boundaries, and we have self-compassion and self-forgiveness for when we do roll down the hill. And maybe I can't do it literally, but my hope is that through this content and my work on narcissistic abuse, please know that in my fashion, I'm always waiting for you at the bottom of that hill. Thanks again for tuning in.